Hi, and welcome to this webinar on Brexit and travel and logistics. My name is Katie Hall, and I'm a solicitor in the commercial team at Gately Legal. For those of you that may not know Gately, we are the main legal advisor to the Sport Recreation Alliance and offer a sort of wide range of commercial advice in the sports sector, ranging from negotiation and preparation of sponsorship agreements, licensing and merchandising, right through to IP protection and data protection. And today I'm here to sort of give you a brief update on the impact of Brexit on the travel and on travel and logistics within the sport and recreation sector. Alongside this webinar, the Sport Recreation Alliance has put together a briefing on travel and logistics. So please take a look for further guidance and links to more useful information once you've had a listen to this webinar, as it will be helpful to guide you to the right places to look for more information on this topic. So here are my details at Gately if you do want to get in touch about anything you've heard today, but I will move on swiftly from this slide so you don't have to look at my face too much longer. The agenda for today is fairly straightforward, and I will start by sort of looking at the latest political developments in the House of Commons, which, as you will appreciate, may change dramatically by the time you listen to this webinar, so I apologise for that in advance. I will then briefly go on to talking about the impact on travelling to and from the EU, planning ahead for a no-deal Brexit, moving sports equipment into and out of the EU, and then briefly touching on firearms and the movement of horses and other equines in and out of the EU. Slide in front of you at the moment sort of gives a brief summary of the latest developments in Parliament. Obviously, as I mentioned, this is probably subject to change, but as things stand at the time of this webinar, the UK is due to leave the UK before the 31st of January 2020. Obviously, the precise terms in which we will leave remain very unclear at the moment, so we do not know, for example, whether there will be a deal or a no deal. But at least for now, we know that a no-deal Brexit has been taken off the table for the 31st of October, and that is, well, at least until the 31st of January. So in the sport and recreation sector, you will also obviously know that being able to travel seamlessly throughout the EU, whether you're a sports person, a coach, an administrator or a volunteer, or simply a spectator going to watch a match, is crucial. So while the majority of those individuals travelling throughout the EU may not actually be required to work in a particular country, there are still a number of things to think about in the event of a no-deal Brexit, particularly if you, as an organisation, need travel and need to be able to rely on travel to participate in or watch sports events. For more information on this particular area, I would advise going and have a look at the webinar and Brexit briefing on immigration prepared by the SRA and my colleague at Gately, and this will go into more detail on this particular subject. But this webinar will just briefly touch on the subject just to give you an idea of the things to think about at this stage. So for EU nationals visiting the UK, in the event of a deal, free movement will continue during any sort of agreed transition period. So there will be no issue for EU nationals wanting to visit the UK. If there is no deal, free movement will still continue under UK law. So there will be no issues for EU nationals wanting to visit the UK. But that will be up until the 31st of December 2020. So from the 1st of January 2021, it will be necessary to assess whether or not a trip will fall within the so-called visitor rules. So if the activities on your intended trip will constitute work and therefore be caught by the new work visa system, then you need to consider whether or not a visa will apply in this scenario. moving on to whether or not a no deal or a deal will affect UK nationals visiting the EU. The current position will be maintained in a transition period as before. However, where there is a no deal Brexit, restrictions will probably take effect sooner than anticipated, including the possibility of this happening immediately after a no deal Brexit. So UK nationals would become subject to the visitor rules, which could obviously vary from country to country. But the EU has indicated that visitor rules will apply to enable UK nationals to travel across the Schengen area, at least without a visa for up to 90 days in any 180-day period. Planning ahead to a no-deal Brexit, what are the sort of things to think about here? I've listed a number of things on the slide. And the first thing to think about really is the trips you've got coming up with your organisation. Do you think any of those trips will fall foul of the visitor rules and require advance entry clearance? I suggest analysing the length, the frequency, and any sort of purpose of the trip to determine whether or not it's going to be appropriate for all the people attending the trip to enter as a visitor. Because if the activities are such that on the trip you will not be permissible as visitors, a visa which allows work will be required. Check also that those intending to travel have a passport and that it's it has no more than 6 months left to run and is not more than 10 years old. It's also worth checking each individual's travel insurance. Does the insurance include healthcare, for example? After Brexit, the European health insurance cards that we've all got in our purses and wallets may not be valid, so it's particularly important you get travel insurance with the right cover if anyone is travelling with pre-existing medical conditions, for example, because the European health insurance cards currently cover pre-existing conditions whilst many insurance policies don't. Do you need an international driving permit? The briefing that goes alongside this webinar sort of has a link to some more guidance on this. So just check that out to figure out whether you need one. And of course, if you're taking your own vehicle, you'll also need a green card, which may take up to about a month to get from your insurance company. So plan ahead, and you'll also need a Great Britain sticker. It's also worth mentioning that regardless whether there is a deal or not, for any trips from the 1st January 2021, you may also need to apply for a pre-travel authorisation via the European Travel Information and Authorisation System, or ETIAS for short. This is once it's fully operational in 2021. It's similar to the ESTA system we use currently for traveling to the US. And it won't cost much, at about €7 currently, I think, for a one-off fee to be paid at the time of the application, and that will be valid for 3 years for an unlimited number of entries. So one of the most crucial things, and I think one of the things addressed the most in the press, is the movement of equipment, and in this sector, obviously, the movement of sports equipment into and out of the EU. So in a no-deal Brexit, the UK will be considered a third country for customs purposes in the EU. So this may mean that you will be required to make custom declarations when taking sports equipment temporarily into and out of the EU. So you may be, for example, a dance organisation or a sports club who's about to go on tour across the EU. If so, you may need certain documentation relating to that equipment, and it's likely that fees will apply. This is essentially because in the absence of any free trade agreement that's agreed between the EU and the UK, free movement of goods will no longer apply to any equipment. Checks at customs, excise, border control will likely to be made entering and leaving the EU and the UK likewise. And there will also need to be a schedule of tariffs and quotas to be made to figure out how we intend to trade going forward under World Trade Organization rules. Obviously, in the long term, that means there is potential for new or additional trade barriers, such as tariffs, on imported sporting goods, such as clothing and footwear, for example, so something to bear in mind going forward. But in the short term, this means that when you're crossing into the EU, you'll therefore need to prove that your equipment is not being taken in there to sell, and that you intend to return all the equipment back to the UK. So this will mean, and the last point of my slides have alluded to it, is that you may need a ATA carnet to ship or hand carry any sort of commercial goods or equipment going forward. The initials ATA are an acronym of the French and English words émission temporaire, or temporary emission. That's just a little fact there for you. But it's essentially a detailed passport for equipment to avoid paying duty on goods brought into the EU for business, commercial reasons. While there is a fee for each carnet issued, and obviously time and hassle involved in putting together a list of all the equipment you intend to take, it will avoid the need for a customs declaration each time you're travelling, and the risk also of goods being seized on entry, which obviously will cause delays, which we could all do without. It can be used for trips covering more than one country, and includes also numerous exits and re-entries in the country of origin during its length. So something to bear in mind, and again, for more guidance on that, please see the government's website, the link of which is on the briefing, which runs alongside this webinar. Just a quick note on transporting firearms. UK residents who want to travel to the EU with firearms or shotguns will no longer be able to apply for a European firearms pass if the UK leaves the EU with that deal. And therefore, you will really need to have a look at the licensing requirements of the particular EU country you're intending to travel to ahead of any sort of travel. So bear that in mind in terms of delays and potential costs, etc. And you will need to do this even though you may be in that country with your firearm and covered by an existing pass when we leave the EU, whenever that may be. So for those of you that regularly transport horses, for example, in and out of the EU, this slide will be of quite significant importance. As you will be aware, the movement of horses and other equines at the moment between France, Ireland and the UK is protected and also facilitated by a tripartite agreement. If we leave the EU without a deal, this will cease to exist. But good news is the UK has recently been granted nationalistic status by the EU, so that will ensure that any sort of racehorses and other equines can move into the EU from the UK in the event of a no deal. Of course, it doesn't mean that's going to result in a seamless movement of horses across the borders, but it will provide a certainty for owners and trainers to looking to race their horses in European meetings. There will, of course, be a number of additional requirements which I've listed on the slide. For example, horses being exported to the EU will need an export health certificate. They may need additional blood tests, which will need to be carried out within 30 days or less of travelling to satisfy EU regs. You'll need to consult a vet with, I think, at least 6 weeks before you plan to travel, so they can confirm any sort of residency and isolation requirements. And they'll also, the horses will also need to enter via a border inspection post. So always leave more time to travel, as they will invariably be a number of additional delays. Horses will also need a government-issued travel ID as well as their existing passport. Further details again are on the Brexit briefing attached to this webinar, so do take a look for more info. And finally, just a word on importing equines from the EU back to the UK. The rules relating to the import of equines will not really change in principle as a result of a no deal. And those registered with the national branch of an international body for sporting and competition purposes, or any horses with passports issued by an EU recognised stud book, will still be able to travel using health attestations. So that is good news all round. Again, more detail is on the Brexit briefing. And the final slide really is just to say that there are a couple of other things to think about here, which we've touched on already. So firstly, do you need to register a trailer for your horse? If so, take a look at the Brexit briefing, which has a link to more detail on that. And again, international driving permits, you may need one of those. And finally, as we've already talked about when we discussed movement of goods and equipment in and out of the EU, you may need to complete a customs declaration form. So where you're thinking of moving the same equine between the UK and EU, you may wish to consider applying for an ATA carnet to streamline this sort of customs procedure. And again, links are available for more information on that. Things to think about on travel logistics should we leave the EU without a deal. Again, if you don't want to listen to my voice thrown on again, it may be easy to take a look at the travel logistics briefing on SRA's website for links to the relevant guidance and other helpful tips. For anything else, do get in touch, and thanks for listening.